Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. In this seminar, we will discuss Descartes' wax example. This seminar started off originally as an episode, so I thought I'm going to handle Descartes' wax example in 10 minutes. I've seen what a number of other people on the internet have done with Descartes' wax example, and I thought, well, I don't want to just repeat that, and in some ways I feel as though there could be more depth to what some of these other people have said in regard to Descartes' wax example. As a result, this is now a seminar-length discussion of just the wax example. At one point in time, I had begun a PowerPoint on Descartes' Meditations, and I couldn't stop myself. I was sort of toggling back and forth between a commentary, a book-length actual book commentary on Descartes' Meditations, which I have been hoping to write and planning to write for a very long time. In truth, though, it's not one of the massive writing projects on the horizon right now, or that I'm actually working on. But I felt like I couldn't put together a PowerPoint on the Meditations without actually putting together, without using this material. And then I think I kind of got bogged down in this idea of trying to simultaneously organize and write the book while putting together this video. Things got quite out of hand. Let's put it that way. So anyway, we're focusing on just the wax now. We're focusing on just the wax, and I hope that you will recognize that there's nothing like this available on the internet, and I've never actually seen anyone discuss Descartes' wax in this way, but I do believe that this is a thorough discussion of Descartes' wax. All right, here we go. So what we're going to see then is that there isn't just one wax example in Descartes. Most people talk as though there's just one wax example, but it turns out that there's actually a significant number of instances in which Descartes discusses wax. So I thought that it would be important to walk through each one of these and then also show the history of the wax example. So as you can see here, Descartes' first wax example actually comes from his rules for directing the mind, or rules for directing your mind. Descartes' second wax example comes from his treatise on light. The third wax example is the most famous wax example, and it comes from the Meditations on First Philosophy, of course. It's also worth discussing and pointing out that when Descartes talks about the wax in the Meditation, Thomas Hobbes' objection to the wax is important for us to note, but then also Descartes' response to Hobbes in regard to the wax is also important for us to note. So I just thought we've got to put all of that in there. Then we see that even after the Meditations, Descartes has another wax example. This appears in the Principles of Philosophy. And then, of course, it's possible to recognize that Descartes talks about the wax, or brings up the wax example, in 3 of his letters. So we'll briefly mention those letters as well. I think this is the way, if you really want to understand, I thought 2 things, right? The one is that if you really want to understand Descartes' wax example, this is the way to do it. But I also kind of felt a little bit, I guess you could say, snarky or something like that. I thought, well, if you are an undergraduate student and you see this video, you will actually understand Descartes. There's a very good chance, at least, that you will understand Descartes' wax example better than the instructor who is teaching you philosophy. So I take some gratification in that. I was happy about it. All right, let's see what else we have. That in regard to the history and sort of general discussion of Descartes' wax. We must use this language also of primary versus secondary qualities. We'll talk a little bit about that. It's important to juxtapose Descartes' wax example with the peripatetic axiom. We'll talk about, this is very simple stuff. Actually, it's very straightforward, but we'll talk more about that when we get there. Again, it's just important. It's the right context in which to see the wax example. And then, I'm kind of surprised that the other videos on the internet don't talk about Plato's wax example or Aristotle's wax example or Avicenna's wax example in relation to Descartes' wax example. And lastly, then, there's an overarching theme that goes on every time that you talk about Descartes. And Descartes is considered, of course, the father of modern philosophy. There are a number of really good candidates for that title of father of modern philosophy, but I have renewed or reconvinced myself, re-persuaded myself as I prepared these PowerPoint slides that Descartes does deserve the title, the father of modern philosophy. And one of the ways in which you can understand, or we can understand, why Descartes is the father of modern philosophy is how Descartes' philosophy is understood in relation to Aristotle. And if you saw the seminars on the the history of philosophy that I put together, then you recall that there is a deep sense in which philosophy up to the modern period, well, we could say philosophy of the Middle Ages, was dominated by Aristotle or Aristotelian philosophy. That, of course, is why the peripatetic axiom is the correct context with which to take a look at Descartes' wax example. So anyway, this is the overview of what we're going to be talking about in this seminar. All right, here we go. So why Descartes? I have such a strange relationship with Descartes. In some ways, I can still remember taking an undergraduate philosophy course in epistemology or an undergraduate philosophy course in criteriology at Kenyon College, and reading Descartes' Meditations. I feel as though Descartes' first two meditations, the discussion of the using doubt as a method to deepen your thinking, and this idea of the various arguments, like, for example, the dream argument to enhance your doubt about what is real and what is not real, what constitutes reality, and how do we know? When I first encountered Descartes, I absolutely loved Descartes. I mean, I just thought that Descartes' Meditations constituted some sort of great accomplishment. I really was drawn to it. But I remember that all my life I have always been drawn to geometry. I remember when I studied geometry in high school, I just loved it. I mean, I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, we were doing geometrical proofs for fun. So outside of the class and that sort of thing. So it makes sense to me on some level that Descartes really appealed to me. Now, the further that you get in philosophy, and I comment on this often, and the reason that I comment on this often is because I really do think that it's important. It's important to keep this in mind, and also I do think that it correctly diagnoses the number one philosophical mistake that is sort of dominating thought during this period of history, right now, right? And this goes all the way. This goes all the way into even political thinking, in my opinion. So the two things are that Descartes really does dominate thinking nowadays, right? It's not surprising to me that Descartes is a substance dualist, and we have lots of issues with binary determinations these days. But, you could ask something like, why do you assume that there is just a binary interpretation? Why do you assume that things are just binary, or why is binary opposition dominating our thinking so much? And because, for example, for Kant, it's not even an issue. It's not even an issue. So I think that binary opposition is dominating our thinking because our thinking is so Cartesian. So I think that it's important to deal with Descartes for that reason. And the other issue that I have with Descartes is just that he doesn't really, to my mind, in my opinion, he just doesn't cut the mustard, right? He initiates something wonderful, but he is insufficient as a metaphysical thinker. So, for those reasons, my relationship with Descartes is complicated because, on the one hand, I feel as though I shouldn't be praising Descartes, and I feel as though we need to move away from Descartes. Yet, on the other hand, I feel as though, Descartes really is appealing to people initially as they enter into philosophy, and Descartes, really does sort of dominate philosophical thinking these days. So that's why Descartes, right? If you ask the question, and again, I just sort of reaffirmed this for myself, but if you ask the question, why is Descartes the father of modern philosophy? The real answer, it seems to me, is this, and I need to qualify this answer sort of immediately right after making it. The answer is because Descartes realized that it is possible to think about reason and relate to reason as though you're doing geometry. So this idea of, Descartes himself says this, I included it in one of the Philosophemes in the Descartes puzzle that's coming up on YouTube. Descartes himself says that he saw the way that geometers formulated geometric proofs, and he wondered if all of rationality or if all of reason could be dealt with in this way. This was, on the one hand, a massive step forward, we could say, especially a massive criteriological step forward. Yet, on the other hand, really, for those of us who love Plato and pay attention to the history of philosophy, we recognize that this is really just a kind of emphasis of Platonic philosophy that then regains the ground over Aristotle that had been gained throughout the Middle Ages. So that's why Descartes. And I just want to say lastly, despite all of this, the use of the geometric method in relation to reason, it really does take us until Kant to put together this extra piece, and I want to qualify that, but to put together this extra piece that we need to critique pure reason, so that the relationship, yes, we can have a scientific relation to thinking, but that we need to qualify that there's an initial distinction to be made, the initial distinction between pure reason and impure reason. Descartes does not have that. And that distinction and what comes from that distinction is so radical, in my opinion, that it is a mistake to think that Kant is merely some kind of successor to Descartes. I think that if you were to try to characterize Kant that way, it would be diminishing Kant and all of his accomplishments. I once was approached by a philosopher. We'll say he was a Thomistic philosopher. I don't know if it's even fair to call him that, but let's say that he was a Thomistic philosopher. And he once said to me, he said, I don't see any difference between Descartes and Kant. He also at another time said, I don't see any difference between Descartes and Hume. And I thought to myself, on the one hand, it would take, if you have a PhD in philosophy and you believe that, I don't know that I can do anything for you, right? Kant himself differentiates himself from Descartes in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant himself differentiates himself from David Hume. Infamously differentiates himself from David Hume. And if you look at the fruit of Kant's philosophy, then you recognize that the tools and the distinctions that gave Kant that fruit, that produced that fruit for Kant, those tools and distinctions just don't exist with Descartes and Hume. So anyway, I apologize if that was more information than what we needed, but I just wanted to be clear that Descartes, excellent philosopher in the history of philosophy. We need to understand Descartes. We need to understand this moment in history when we see this shift from Aristotle's dominance to a more Platonic picture. Yet at the same time, there are so many problems with Descartes. There are so many problems with Descartes' philosophy from the point of view of Kant's philosophy that I find myself being reluctant to endorse Descartes too much. So I just wanted to say that there are so many candidates. Up here on the board, we've got Copernicus, we've got Galileo, we've got Da Vinci, we've got Talisio, and we've got Giordano Bruno, of course. So we have all of these excellent thinkers from the Middle Ages and the Italian Renaissance. I feel as though, we don't want to give Descartes too much credit. Even Nietzsche himself says that modern philosophy all of modern philosophy can be traced back to the Renaissance. I believe in some ways that is true, but I guess we will give Descartes credit for putting it together in a way, just like we have to give Kant credit later, right? For putting together this philosophy in a way that had not been put together before. So anyway, that's why Descartes. Okay, what else? Okay, here we go. We'll look again at the peripatetic axiom, but I think that it's very important to recognize up front here that the peripatetic axiom is the correct context in which to see what Descartes is up to. There's nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. So if you have any idea of what has been referred to as Descartes' notion of innate ideas, you'll already recognize what Descartes is doing in relation to the peripatetic axiom. The peripatetic axiom is referred to as the peripatetic axiom because it's supposed to refer to the peripatetics, or Aristotle's school of philosophy. Having said that, what we're going to see, and we're going to see this explicitly with the wax example, that Descartes is going to be asking the question, how is it that we know something about the wax, right? So we seem to have knowledge, therefore we seem to have something in the intellect that does not come from the senses. And the wax example emphasizes that. So we'll see that here in a moment. Descartes' philosophical essays and correspondence. This is what I was using, and this is what I used in the classroom. The reason that I use this in the classroom is because I like the collection of these writings, and I thought that it was a good price. But in hindsight, and when I actually put this together in the background, I had to use the 3-volume set of Descartes' complete works. And the reason that I had to do that is because in the philosophical essays and correspondence, the rules for the direction of the mind is abbreviated. And of course, I needed it to not be abbreviated. So if you're asking the question of what texts should I look at, I would say to you, if you're only going to pick up one text, this is an excellent text to pick up, the philosophical essays and correspondence. However, if you really want to engage some of Descartes' earlier works, it may just be best to actually pick up the 3 volumes of his complete works. This is Descartes' first wax example. Again, no one talks about this on the internet. I thought that it would be helpful to point this out. And again, I suspect that your instructor, your philosophy instructor at the university probably doesn't know this. So you can score some points, if there is such a thing, by raising your hand and bringing this to light in the classroom. Notice that in Descartes' rule number 12, he says that the 12th rule summarizes all of the previous rules. So we'll see here in a moment that rule number 12 sums up the prior 11 rules, and he says in rule number 12 that knowledge of things, and I'm trying to emphasize, I want to be sure to emphasize the word thing here, because it's a technical term once we get to transcendental philosophy. But so knowledge of things involves two factors. Okay, the first is ourselves, and the second is objects of knowledge. So when we're talking about ourselves, he distinguishes between four faculties of knowledge. These are all in the previous excerpt that I just had up on the screen. So these four faculties of knowledge are the intellect, imagination, sense perception, and memory. Okay, and all of this you'll see the relevance of all of this here in a moment. Then in regard to objects of knowledge, he tells us that there are three key questions, right? And those questions are, what presents itself spontaneously? So, for example, when I'm having an experience, I enter into a situation and I have an experience, what presents itself spontaneously in that situation? Like bumping a microphone. How can one thing be known on the basis of something else? And I think that this is actually a really important question. How can a criteriological question, of course, but how can something be known on the basis of something else? And then lastly, what further conclusions can be drawn from each of the answers to these two questions? I'm trying to make sure that this isn't too long of a seminar, but okay, I'm just going to go with the summary rather than reading this to you, because as you can see, it really does summarize exactly what's stated here in rule number 12. Okay, so when we look at this first wax example, then there are 5 parts to this wax example, right? And Descartes uses a wax example for the sake of the first part of what we saw on this slide. Okay, so in discussing ourselves and the 4 faculties of knowledge. All right, here we go. So Descartes tells us, but since I cannot do that here, it will be sufficient if I explain as briefly as possible what, for my purposes, is the most useful way of conceiving everything within us which contributes to our knowledge of things, right? So again, remember, knowledge of things involves 2 factors, and we're looking at the first factor here, which is ourselves. Of course, you are not obliged to believe that things are as I suggest, but what is to prevent you from following these suppositions if it is obvious that they detract not a jot from the truth of things, but simply make everything much clearer? This is just what you do in geometry when you make certain assumptions about quantity, which in no way weaken the force of the demonstrations, even though in physics you often take a different view of the nature of quantity. All right. So what we're going to see here is how the wax example functions for Descartes. And he tells us that color always comes in a shape. Now, this is, of course, around 1620. And so Descartes, there is no Newton yet. Descartes thinks some very strange things to our mind. If you follow Parmenides, then this might not be so strange to you, but Descartes has some strange ideas about space. Because Descartes has some strange ideas about space, he has these kinds of further thoughts. For example, that color always comes in a shape. If you think about this, it's true. Even if I were to show you any example of a color, I would show it to you in some form, right? Some shape. So, but the reason for this is because Descartes has a strange idea in regard to space. This will come out later. But here are the 5 parts that relate to this wax example from the direction of your mind, or the rules for directing the mind. Color always comes in a shape. Sense perception activates common sense. Imagination is like wax to common sense. Okay? Imagination is like wax to common sense. He also wants to point out, and he takes a very long time to say this, I sum it up very quickly by saying that he wants to point out that imagination is capable of free association. And then lastly, the intellect is spiritual and completely distinct from the body. This, of course, is a major part of the meditations that will appear later. So this is rule number 12. And he tells us, let us then conceive of the matter in the following way. First, insofar as our external senses are all parts of the body, sense perception, strictly speaking, is merely passive, even though our application of the senses to objects involves action, namely local motion. Sense perception occurs in the same way in which wax takes on an impression from a seal. So, it should not be thought that I have a mere analogy in mind here. We must think of the external shape of the sentient body as being really changed by the object in exactly the same way as the shape of the surface of the wax is altered by the seal. This is the case, we must admit, not only when we feel some body as having a shape, as being hard or rough to the touch, etc., but also when we have a tactile perception of heat or cold and the like. The same is true of the other senses. Thus, in the eye, the first opaque membrane receives the shape impressed upon it by multicolored light. He goes on to talk about the different sense organs. This is a most helpful way of conceiving these matters, since nothing is more readily perceivable by the senses than shape, for it can be touched as well as seen. Moreover, the consequences of this supposition are no more false than those of any other. Okay, so let's keep going. The same can be said about everything perceivable by the senses, since it is certain that the infinite multiplicity of figures is sufficient for the expression of all the differences in perceptible things. Really, Descartes here is discussing a process of symbolization. But you can read it if you'd like, because I have it in front of you, but I'm not going to read it to you because it's going to take us too far afield. Secondly, when an external sense organ is stimulated by an object, the figure which it receives is conveyed at one and the same moment to another part of the body, known as the common sense, without any entity really passing from the one to the other. In exactly the same way, I understand that while I am writing, at the very moment when individual letters are traced on the paper, not only does the point of the pen move, but the slightest motion of this part cannot but be transmitted simultaneously to the whole pen. All these various motions are traced out in the air by the tip of the quill, even though I do not conceive of anything real passing from one end to the other. Who then would think that the connection between the parts of the human body is less close than that between the parts of the pen? What simpler way of portraying the matter can be imagined? So here we have this vision of sort of vibration moving throughout the body after we make contact with something that is external to the mind. Okay. Thirdly, the common sense functions like a seal. So here we go. The common sense functions like a seal, fashioning in the fantasy or imagination as if in wax the same figures or ideas which come pure and without body from the external senses. Fantasy is a genuine part of the body and is large enough to allow different parts of it to take on many different figures and generally to retain them for some time, in which case it is to be identified with what we call memory. So very quickly, just bounce back here so you can see what's going on. Notice that we're going through the four faculties for knowledge. So is very straightforward here. We're going through the four faculties of knowledge, intellect, imagination, sense perception, and memory. This is because we're trying to figure out how it is that we have knowledge of things that are mind external. When coming into contact with the senses, a process of symbolization can be articulated. That's what he was suggesting here with the different colors. The idea then is that the common sense functions like a seal, that it impresses into the imagination. Not only is this imagination, but it functions as a kind of memory. Okay, so then fourthly, the motive power, that is the nerves themselves, has its origin in the brain where the corporeal imagination is located, and the latter moves the nerves in different ways, just as the common sense is moved by the external senses, or the whole pen is moved by the lower end. This example also shows how the corporeal imagination can be the cause of many different movements in the nerves. Here we have this first example of the wax. And then lastly, the power through which we know things in the strict sense, is purely spiritual, and is no less distinct from the whole body than blood is distinct from bone, or the hand from the eye. It is one single power, whether it receives figures from the common sense at the same time as does the corporeal imagination, or applies itself to those which are preserved in the memory, or forms new ones which so preoccupy the imagination that it is often in no position to receive ideas from the common sense at the same time, or to transmit them to the power responsible for motion in accordance with a purely corporeal mode of operation. In all these functions, the cognitive power is sometimes passive, sometimes active, sometimes resembling the seal, sometimes the wax. But this should be understood merely as an analogy, for nothing quite like this power is to be found in corporeal things. It's interesting because earlier he told us to not understand it merely as an analogy. It is one and the same power. When applying itself along with imagination to the common sense, it is said to see, touch, etc. When addressing itself to the imagination alone, insofar as the latter is invested with various figures, it is said to remember. When applying itself to the imagination in order to form new figures, it is said to imagine or conceive. And lastly, when it acts on its own, it is said to understand. How understanding comes about, I shall explain at greater length in the appropriate place. So you can see again what the wax example, Descartes' first wax example, is doing for him. Basically, he is suggesting that the wax is a kind of midpoint that is allowing for knowledge of external things, mind external things. This is, even though this is very different in some ways from his third wax example in the Meditations, we can also see that this is actually very similar. So here we have then the last piece from the Rules for the Direction of Your Mind. Let's see. Here we go. So the intellect, going through all of those faculties. The intellect can either be stimulated by the imagination or act upon it. Likewise, the imagination can act upon the senses through the motive force by directing them to objects, while the senses in their turn can act upon the imagination by depicting the images of bodies upon it. But memory is no different from imagination, at least the memory which is corporeal and similar to the one which animals possess. So I would refer to this as I would agree with Descartes here. I would agree with him, and I would suggest that there's memory at a even more primary, or to use Descartes' language, we would say that there's memory even at the level of sense perception. Descartes and Kant, even Kant, seem to want to focus on just the location of memory at the level of imagination. All right, so there we go. So a plurality of things cannot be of assistance to the intellect in distinctly intuiting individual things. Rather, in order to deduce a single thing from a collection of things, we must discard from the ideas of the things whatever does not demand our present attention, so that the remaining features can be retained more readily in the memory. In the same way, it is not the things themselves which should be displayed to the external senses, but rather certain abbreviated representations of them. And the more compact these are, the handier they are, provided they act as adequate safeguards against lapses of memory. If we observe all these points, then I think we shall omit nothing which pertains to this part of the rule. And I recognize here that, and I thought that it was just important to just put all this in here so that it's available for you. I recognize that it is possible to read Descartes here as saying something like, it is not possible to know the things in themselves. At the same time, it is, if we understand Kant, it is just not possible to say that because of that, they have the same criteriology or the same epistemology. And of course, if someone were to argue that way against me, or against us, I would suggest, or I would respond to them by saying that there were plenty of pre-Socratic thinkers and thinkers before Descartes that didn't believe that it was possible to know the thing in itself, and that doesn't make them equivalent to Kant or make their criteriology equivalent to that of Kant's. Okay, so again, this is not an elaborated or celebrated wax example in Descartes. However, it is a wax example in Descartes. So you can see his use of it to make sense of things external to the mind, how we know things external to the mind, and especially his equating it analogously with the power of imagination, with the imagination. And of course, he uses this example to discuss the four faculties of knowledge for knowing things external to the mind. That was Descartes' first wax example. Here now is Descartes' second wax example. I really like Descartes' second wax example. Descartes' second wax example comes from his writing The World, or I prefer to refer to it as the Treatise on Light, from 1632. All right, what I've done is just very quickly, I've excerpted some paragraphs, so we can just look at a couple paragraphs or a few paragraphs together. This is the second paragraph of the first chapter, and you can see here that the chapter title is on the difference between our sensations and the things that produce them. So one of the things that you're going to recognize as we move through all of the examples is that there's a consistent theme that Descartes continues to use the wax examples to sort of make sense of and to explicate and articulate. So I think it's important to recognize that. As you well know, words have no resemblance to the things they signify, yet they do not fail to make us conceive of the things. Often, even when we are not paying attention to the sound of the words or to their syllables. It can happen in this way that after we have heard a discourse whose meaning we have very well understood, we might not be able to say in what language it has been spoken. Now, if words, which signify nothing except by human convention, suffice to make us conceive of things to which they bear no resemblance, why could not nature have established a certain sign that makes us have the sensation of light, even though that sign does not have anything in itself similar to that sensation? Is it not thus that she has established laughter and tears, so that we may read joy and sadness on the face of men? This is a fun little distinction that can sometimes be emphasized and exploited to illustrate many things. One of the things that I like to do in the classroom is to overemphasize the sound of a word, and by overemphasizing the sound of that word, sort of put it in an awkward light. And by putting it in an awkward light, there's a sense in which you can hear it for the first time. So this immediately is jumping into my mind whenever Descartes says that words have no resemblance to things they signify. And this idea that even though when you say the word, or the word, that it helps us realize how there's a sense in which we are hearing noise, that we are hearing noise, and that we are making sense of the noise, which is a mind external thing. And we are making sense of the noise, and we're so good at doing it that we don't even notice that we're doing it, right? So Descartes' point is that the fact that these sounds don't resemble whatever it is that they're referring to, like a dog, for example, or like dog, that it could also be the same way with the senses. And when we are using sense perception to recognize that there is something in the environment that we are experiencing. Okay, I really enjoy this second wax example. All right, so let's see what else we got going on here. This is the fourth paragraph of the first chapter. Descartes says, "Do you think that even when we are not paying attention to the meaning of words and hear only their sound, the idea of this sound formed in our thought is something similar to the object that is its cause? A person opens his mouth, moves his tongue, pushes out his breath. I do not see anything in these actions that is not very different from the idea of sound they make us imagine. Most philosophers assure us that sound is nothing other than a certain vibration of air that strikes our ears. Thus, if the sense of hearing related the true image of its object to our thought, it would have to make us conceive the motion of the parts of air that is then vibrating against our ear, instead of making us conceive of the sound, right? So, well said, Descartes. But perhaps not everyone will want to believe what the philosophers say, so I shall bring forward another example. All right, here we go. Here is Descartes' other example then. This is the sixth paragraph of the chapter. He says, "Now I see no reason that requires us to believe that what is in the objects from which the sensation of light comes to us is any more similar to that sensation than the actions of a feather or of a strap are to tickling and to pain." I'm sure all the psychoanalysts are having a lot of fun with this. And yet I did not bring forward these examples to make you believe absolutely that this light is different in the objects and in our eyes, but only so that you might feel doubtful about this matter and could keep yourself from having a prepossession to the contrary. And you can now better examine with me what light is about. Okay, so the tricky thing about this wax example is that Descartes doesn't mention wax. But again, the idea here is that the change to the common sense, or the change to imagination, the unifying power of the senses is how I like to refer to it. I don't want to give him too much Kant, but the unifying power of the senses does not have to be a one-to-one correspondence, or does not have to exactly match that thing that is external to the mind that we are sensing. So it's the same idea that as the wax takes on a kind of shape, right? You're going to see this later in the presentation, but notice that it doesn't take on the material of the seal, right? It doesn't take on the material of that which originally had the shape. So, for example, if you have some kind of a brass ring that you stick into the wax, or if you take some wooden figure and you stick it into the wax does not become brass, or the wax does not become wooden. So there is still some sense in which, even though the wax now has the shape of whatever it was that you just smashed into the wax, it is still the case that the wax is wax. It is still the case that the wax is different from that which just gave it the impression. That difference then may lead to, for example, in relation to knowing things, it may influence our knowledge of things in a way such that we do not know the things in themselves. We do not know the things exactly. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go, but this is, to my mind, this is Descartes' second wax example. In order to understand Descartes' second wax example more thoroughly, I thought that it would be important to look at a few things. And in looking at these things, in looking at these Latin root words, I'm looking at them and I'm thinking that they have efficacy beyond this discussion of Descartes. So I think it's important to take a look at these. Even if you feel as though I already understand Descartes' wax example, it's still important to recognize what we're talking about here. Okay, so notice then we can look at these different parts of terms. So, for example, ob, sub, and pro. So we're also going to look at ject. So ob, sub, pro, and ject. All right, the Latin root ject means to throw. The Latin root ob means toward, over, or against. The Latin root sub means under, and the Latin root pro means in front of or forward. Therefore, an object, and I've been trying to put a hyphen in here to kind of emphasize this, but an object of the mind is that which is thrown against a thing in the environment. Right? So there is some mind external thing. And when I come into contact with this thing through my senses, eventually an object is formed in my mind. Right? We have to agree that the tree in your mind is different from the tree in the yard, right? So I cannot climb, well, maybe I could climb the tree in the yard all the way to the top, but I wouldn't attempt it. But I could climb the tree in my mind right now, right? So, or maybe you could say, in my imagination, I could climb the tree in my mind. Technically, I guess I can't use this hand to grab a hold of the tree in my mind. Okay, so if we recognize that there's a difference between the thing in the environment that is mind external and the object that refers to that thing, we'll leave it at this. The object that refers to that thing that is mind external or in the mind external environment, then it's very helpful, in my opinion, to keep in mind what object means, the word object means, how to understand an object of the mind. So here we see that an object of the mind is that which is thrown against a thing in the environment. So it is as though my mind throws a mental construction toward sense perceptions. When my mind throws a mental construction toward the sense perceptions, then there is a sense in which we can say that that object of the mind represents the thing in the mind external environment. Okay, notice then that a subject is that which is under the throw. Derrida makes a lot of, Derrida started advocating for the use of the term subjectile. And I think that one of the reasons that he wanted to talk about subjectile was to help us understand that this is to be thought of dynamically. But it seems to me that the problem that most Cartesian thinkers have is not so much that they don't think dynamically, but that rather they don't recognize that they don't recognize the root ject in the words object and subject. So it seems to me that if you recognize that this is dynamic, then it doesn't make sense to think that there is some object that is somewhere, and just as it doesn't make sense to think that there is some object that is somewhere, it doesn't make sense to think that there is a subject that is somewhere. And yet, when these Lacanians and when these psychoanalysts when these psychoanalysts hear this stuff, then they immediately want to think, I don't exist. But that's silly. I'm the one sitting here saying that I don't exist, right? So in some way, it makes sense to say that there is a subject that we are discussing, but you can't reify it, right? You can't hypostasize it. It is the temporary subject that is under the throw of the object which we are enunciating as we have an experience of things in the environment. But the problem is that when the psychoanalysts get caught up with this idea of the subject, they overlook the self as a transcendental reality in the mind external environment. So you could go so far as to say something like, the self does exist, and the self may appear as various subjects, but the self is not any of those subjects, right? So if you are subjected to rainfall, or if you are, I don't know, for some reason, I'm thinking about being on a boat or something. If you're on a boat, you're subjected to being on a boat, but that doesn't mean that you're always on a boat. So we want to keep in mind that this is where the word subject comes from. It comes from this idea of when I'm having an experience of mind external reality, there is an object in my mind. My mind is throwing something up against the sense perceptions, and the subject is that which is under that throw. Okay, so an object of the mind, of course, is mental. The thing toward which the powers of the mind have been thrown is not mental. So as to not get too caught up with the word mental here, it is sufficient to recognize that things and mental constructions differ ontologically. We went over this already. The being of a mental, for example, this is my favorite example. I think when I first realized this was the example that really stuck with me. The being of a mental cheeseburger is actually different from the being of an actual cheeseburger, even if the mental cheeseburger accurately characterizes the actual cheeseburger, criteriologically speaking. So, for example, even if I'm able to imagine every detail, right, the wax doesn't take on the wood of the seal. The wax doesn't take on the brass of the ring. So even if I am able to imagine every single detail of a cheeseburger that's sitting in front of me, it's still the case that there is a difference between the cheeseburger in my mind or the object of my experience and that thing in the environment that is the cheeseburger that I'm calling a cheeseburger. Okay, so hence all of Descartes' wax examples, as we will see, discuss the distinction between mind internal and mind external reality. This is announced in the title of his chapter from, for example, the second wax example when he says that on the difference between our sensations and the things that produce them. Descartes' third wax example, the next one, it differs from this second example by adding change across time. So Descartes' second wax example is synchronic, and his third wax example is diachronic. Here we go. So this is Descartes' third wax example, and this is the most famous wax example. This is the one that most people will just think of whenever they hear Descartes' wax example. Okay, so meditation number 2 from Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, concerning the nature of the human mind, that it is better known than the body. So there's almost a sense here in which if you're tracking across these wax examples, and including the second wax example, that if you're tracking across these wax examples, Descartes is becoming more ontological in his thinking. So initially it's almost entirely criteriological, and then we're becoming using these criteriological distinctions to draw ontological conclusions. This is the 11th paragraph of the Meditations, and this is important for us to take a look at together. Let us consider those things which are commonly believed to be the most distinctly grasped of all, namely the bodies we touch and see. Not bodies in general, mind you, for these general perceptions are apt to be somewhat more confused, but one body in particular. Let us take, for instance, this piece of wax. It has been taken quite recently from the honeycomb. It has not yet lost all the honey flavor. Descartes goes through all 5 senses. So we just talked about taste. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was collected. Its color, shape, and size are manifest. It is hard and cold. It is easy to touch. If you rap on it with your knuckle, it will emit a sound. In short, everything is present in it that appears needed to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But notice, so with all of the senses, I am able to come to know that this is a piece of wax. This thing is a piece of wax. But notice that as I am speaking, I am bringing it close to the fire. The remaining traces of the honey flavor are disappearing. The scent is vanishing. The color is changing. The original shape is disappearing. Its size is increasing. It is becoming liquid and hot. You can hardly touch it. And now, when you rap on it, it no longer emits any sound. Does the same wax still remain? I must confess that it does, and that no one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So what was there in the wax that was so distinctly grasped? Certainly none of the aspects that I reached by means of the senses. Whatever came under the senses, and he goes to, whatever came under the 5 senses has changed. Every single one of them. He announces, you could say, the wax at point A and the wax at point B. This is an example of wax melting. I thought that it would be fun for us to look at together. I got this from Candle Amour. So if you could imagine what it smells like and what it feels like. So is that the same thing? Is that the same thing as it was at the beginning? Right? Is that the same thing? Of course it is. So Descartes' question is that how do we know this? And if you're thinking about the peripatetic axiom, for example, then you're asking this criteria with which we know that this thing is the same thing that we just experienced before the fire. Where does that criteria come from? Right? Was that criteria in the senses? Because that criteria does not seem to have come from the senses. So in this sense, we can say that Descartes is posing a real challenge to the peripatetic axiom, that there may in fact be something in the intellect that was not previously in the senses. I guess if it's just going to keep playing. Okay. Notice then, this is the 12th paragraph of the Meditations. Perhaps the wax was what I now think it is, namely that the wax itself never really was the sweetness of the honey, nor the fragrance of the flowers, nor the whiteness, nor the shape, nor the sound, but instead was a body that a short time ago manifested itself to me in these ways, and now does so in other ways. But just what precisely is this thing that I thus imagine? Let us focus our attention on this and see what remains after we have removed everything that does not belong to the wax. Only that it is something extended, flexible, and mutable. But what is it to be flexible and mutable? Is it what my imagination shows it to be, namely that this piece of wax can change from a round to a square shape, or from the latter to a triangular shape? Not at all, for I grasp that the wax is capable of innumerable changes of this sort, even though I am incapable of running through these changes by using my imagination. So this connects us up with the Chiliagon example in the Meditations, but we'll keep going here. So notice then he asks, therefore, this insight is not achieved by the faculty of imagination. So we're asking about this criteria, this piece that allows us to know that the wax is the same despite melting in the fire, right? He's telling us that this criteria does not belong to imagination. What is it to be extended? Is this thing's extension also unknown? For it becomes greater in wax that is beginning to melt, greater in boiling wax, and greater still as the heat is increased. So we just discussed this idea of what is it to be mutable, and now we're asking what is it to be extended? Is this thing's extension also unknown? How am I, if the wax takes up a certain amount of space before it melts, and then the wax takes up more space after it melts, how am I supposed to think about this thing that doesn't change? Right? How am I supposed to think about this mind external thing that is the wax? Which shape is it? Or is it capable of all sorts of different shapes? So this is his discussion of what it means for the wax to be extended and what it means for the wax to be mutable. So then notice he says, and I would not judge correctly what the wax is if I did not believe that it takes on an even greater variety of dimensions than I could ever grasp with the imagination. It remains then for me to concede that I do not grasp what this wax is through the imagination. Rather, I perceive it through the mind alone. The point I am making refers to this particular piece of wax, for the case of wax in general is clearer still. But what is this piece of wax which is perceived only by the mind? Surely it is the same piece of wax that I see, touch, and imagine. In short, it is the same piece of wax I took it to be from the very beginning. But I need to realize that the perception of the wax is neither a seeing nor a touching, nor an imagining, nor has it ever been, even though it previously seemed so. Rather, it is an inspection on the part of the mind alone. This inspection can be imperfect and confused as it was before, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on how closely I pay attention to the things in which the piece of wax consists. So this is one of the reasons why Descartes' thinking pretty quickly gets us into a kind of matrix type thinking, right? That my mind is able to recognize that my body is experiencing things that suggest a reality to me that my mind knows is not true. Schopenhauer will have a ton to say about that later as well. But in using contemporary language, we could say something like, it is as if my body is immersed in a kind of simulation and my mind is able to recognize this. It is as if the animal body is living in a simulation and I am an intellect that is somehow attached to this animal body. And I am able to help this animal wake up and realize that it is living in a kind of simulation, right? That it is experiencing, for example, the melting of wax as very different things, when in reality, outside of the sense perception simulation, in reality, it is the same thing. So then we can ask questions like, well, what is the thing in mind external reality? Okay, last slide in regard to the third wax example then. This is paragraph 14. He says, let us then go forward, inquiring on when it was that I perceived more perfectly and evidently what the piece of wax was. Was it when I first saw it and believed I knew it by the external sense, or at least by the so-called common sense, that is, the power of imagination? Or do I have a more perfect knowledge now, when I have diligently examined both what the wax is and how it is known? Surely it is absurd to be in doubt about this matter. For what was there in my initial perception that was distinct? What was there that any animal seemed incapable of possessing? But indeed, when I distinguish the wax from its external forms, as if stripping it of its clothing, and look at the wax in its nakedness, then even though there can be still an error in my judgment, nevertheless, I cannot perceive it thus without a human mind. So again, this distinction between an intellect and the animal, or the imagination as an animalistic power of the body. The imagination as an animalistic power of the body, and the intellect as this power that transcends the animal imagination and is able to, for example, correct and direct, thinking back to the first wax example, the animal. Okay, so a brief discussion here then of the third wax example before we look at Hobbes's objection. So as we'll see by the end of this presentation, Descartes can be read as emphasizing an anti-Aristotelian or an anti-Aristotle interpretation of reality, an anti-Aristotle ontology. For now, we can notice that Descartes' third wax example distinguishes between the object of bodily awareness and the object of mental awareness. So you could say something like the object of bodily awareness, the condition for the possibility of the object of bodily awareness is imagination, is the power of imagination. And the condition for the possibility of the object of mental awareness is the intellect, according to Descartes. Okay, so meditation 2 then, concerning the nature of the human mind, that it is better known than the body. So that was, of course, what we were just discussing. And Notice that Descartes famously calls the former confused and obscure and the latter clear and distinct. So I think that if you're taking an Introduction to Philosophy course somewhere and you're looking at the wax example, if you go through what we just discussed there, you should be solid. And I think that if you are able to pull in all of the rest of this presentation, I think that you will have a deeper understanding of Descartes' wax example than even your instructor. Okay. So despite the fact that the object of bodily awareness, the body's awareness of the wax, changes, we still understand that it is the same piece of wax. If it is true that it is the same piece of wax, and as Descartes points out, no one would say it isn't, then the mind's objective awareness is more clear and distinct than the body's objective awareness. The body's objectivity suggests the wax is different, but the mind's objectivity suggests the wax is the same. Hence, according to Descartes, it is as if the thing is not changing, but rather it is the object of the body's awareness that is changing. Further, the mind is capable of understanding that the thing remains the same. In other words, the thing remains what it is, though technically this may be seen as Descartes' version of the philosophical puzzle known as the ship of Theseus. I want to point out, or I want to stay with Descartes, but this is something that you can look at later. The ship of Theseus puzzle is really excellent. It's a lot of fun. Even though Descartes isn't saying bodily awareness and mental awareness, I think that if you are saying bodily awareness and mental awareness, that it makes the discussion flow a little easier. And of course, bodily awareness is animalistic, bodily awareness is imagination, bodily awareness is obscure and confused, and mental awareness is the intellect, and it is clear and distinct. Okay, here's Hobbes' objection. So Hobbes is the author of the third set of objections to Descartes' Meditations. This is objection number 2 from Hobbes. And it should be noted that Hobbes' critique of Descartes' ontology is spot on correct. So what you'll see here, so what you're about to see here is that Descartes essentially dodges Hobbes' critique here. So here we go. Against Meditation 2, concerning the nature of the human mind, objection number 2. Hobbes says, quoting Descartes, I am a thing that thinks, quite true. For from the fact that I think or have a phantasm, whether I am asleep or awake, it can be inferred that I am thinking. For I think means the same thing as I am thinking. From the fact that I am thinking, it follows that I am, since that which thinks is not nothing. But when Descartes appends that it is a mind or soul or understanding or reason, a doubt arises. For it does not seem a valid argument to say, quote, I am thinking, therefore I am a thought, end quote, or I am understanding, therefore I am an understanding. For in the same way, I could just as well say, I am walking, therefore I am an act of walking. Thus, Mr. Descartes equates the thing that understands with an act of understanding, which is an act of the thing that understands. Or he at least is equating a thing that understands with the faculty of understanding, which is a power of a thing that understands. Nevertheless, all philosophers draw a distinction between a subject and its faculties and acts. That is, between a subject and its properties and essences. For a being itself is one thing, and its essence is another. Therefore, it is possible for a thing that thinks to be the subject in which the mind, reason, or understanding inhere, and therefore this subject may be something corporeal. The opposite is assumed and not proved by Descartes. Nevertheless, this inference is the basis for the conclusion that Descartes wants Descartes seems to want to establish. Okay. I think Hobbes is absolutely correct here. So Descartes' reply to Hobbes is worth looking at here because Descartes mentions the wax example. However, Hobbes's point regarding Descartes' ontology of the self is absolutely correct. And this is the Cartesian subjectivity that continues to plague Western philosophy, in my opinion. Okay, here we go. So this is Descartes' reply to the third set of objections. This is paragraph 6 of objection number 2 from the third set of objections. Descartes' response to Hobbes, however, logicians and people in general. So I jumped ahead in Descartes' response, and then I'm going to backtrack because here he mentions the wax. However, logicians and people in general normally say that some substances are spiritual while others are corporeal. I'm thinking of the Malebranche Philosophemes presently. And the only thing I proved by means of the example of the piece of wax was that color, hardness, and shape do not belong to the essence of the wax. For in that passage, I was treating neither the essence of the mind nor that of the body. So notice that Descartes dodges Hobbes's critique here. What Descartes says about the wax is true here, but Hobbes's critique that the wax example doesn't prove the self is a mental substance still stands. So this is the first paragraph then of Descartes' reply to objection number 4 from the third set of objections by Hobbes. Descartes' reply, he says, I have explained here the difference between imagination and a concept of the pure mind, when in the example of the piece of wax, I enumerated those things in the wax that we entertain in our imagination and those that we conceive with the mind alone. But I also explained elsewhere how one and the same thing, say a pentagon, can be understood by us in one way and imagined by us in another. However, in reasoning, there is a joining together not of names, but of things signified by these names. And I marvel that the contrary could enter anyone's mind. For who doubts that a Frenchman and a German could come to precisely the same conclusions about the very same things, even though they conceive very different words? Okay. So in regard to Hobbes, he says, for if Hobbes admits that something is being signified by these words, why does he not want our reasonings to be about this something which is signified, rather than about mere words? And certainly by the same license with which he concludes that the mind is a motion, he could also conclude that the sky is the earth or whatever else he pleases. In sum, then, it is important to look at Descartes' response to Hobbes, not because Descartes defeats Hobbes's critique, but rather because it provides a summary by Descartes of how he understood his third wax example. Namely, 1, that there is a distinction between mental and bodily substances, and bodily awareness of bodies is not as clear and distinct as mental awareness of bodies. And 2nd, that things are more accurately characterized by mental awareness rather than by bodily awareness. Okay. All right, so this is the fourth wax example then. And this wax example comes from Descartes' Principles of Philosophy. Part 2, the Principles of Material Things. Notice here, Descartes says that, first, sensory perceptions do not teach us what is really in things, but merely what is useful or harmful to man's composite nature. And then here we see the nature of body does not consist in weight, hardness, color, and so on, but in extension alone. So, in this way, we shall perceive that the nature of matter or body in its universal aspect, does not consist in its being hard or heavy or colored or affecting our senses in some other way, but solely in its being something extended in length, breadth, and depth. So here, notice we get that the essence, this was in the Meditations as well, that the essence of body is extension. And then by the time we get to the Principles, we have this idea that extended body is matter, right? So extension, matter, and body essentially are all equal here. You could say 3 points of view on the same thing. All right. For as regards hardness, we do not know anything of it by sense, except that the portions of the hard bodies resist the motion of our hands when they come into contact with them. But if, whenever we moved our hands in some direction, all the bodies in that part retreated with the same speed as our hands approached them, thinking like a magnet repulsing, we should never feel hardness, and yet we have no reason to believe that the bodies receding in this way would on this account lose what makes them bodies. It follows that the nature of body does not consist in hardness. The same reason shows us that weight, color, and all the other qualities of the kind perceived in corporeal matter may be taken from it while it remains intact. Thus it follows that the nature of body depends on none of these. All right, so notice that Descartes invokes the melting of the wax, pointing out that hardness is not what makes a body a body. Rather, his answer is extension. He equates matter with body and claims the essence of body is extension. Okay. In regard to Descartes' letters, the wax example appears in 3 of Descartes' letters. His letter from November 13th of 1639, a letter written May 2nd of 1644, and a letter written February 9th of 1645. In the 1639 letter, Descartes mentions the chiliagon and melting wax, and he refers to the wax example as imagination's power of free association and its limits. So we'll see some of this here a little bit later on, but this is a sort of paraphrase of what he uses how he uses the wax example in the 1639 letter. In the 1644 letter, he puts together an analogy, and that analogy, he suggests that the soul is to ideas as wax is to impressions. So you can see Descartes really likes the idea that the wax receives impressions to formulate all sorts of analogies. And then lastly here, the natural body versus the mathematical or numerical body. We'll have more to say about that later when we get to Avicenna's wax example, but for now I'll just say that appears in the 1645 letter explicitly. And in discussing this wax example idea in the 1645 letter, he points out that numerical identity does not depend on the identity of the bodies counted. For example, you can count shoes or lightning bugs. I think this is a further elaboration of the idea that when the wax takes on the impression from the seal, it takes on the form, but it does not take on the matter. So a lot of profound thoughts can be derived from that insight. But we'll take a look at some of these here in a moment. All right, so those are the letters in which the wax example appears. So the value of examining all of the wax examples together, the same wax example is used to illustrate different points. These points can be divided into the criteriological and the ontological. The criteriological pertain to knowledge of reality and how it is gained, or our access to knowledge of reality. And the ontological pertain to differentiating and identifying powers of the soul. That is to say, they are points pertaining to psychological ontology. So what I wanted to do is kind of use our are different categories of understanding philosophy to summarize what Descartes is up to, but not only what he's up to, but also the value of seeing all of these wax examples together. Remember then the peripatetic axiom that there's nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. There is some sense in which Descartes' wax example offers an alternative to this by suggesting that the peripatetic axiom doesn't seem to be able to make sense of, or doesn't seem to be able to account for how we understand that something has not changed despite all of the objects in our mind that refer to the thing, despite the changing of all of those objects. This is a distinction that is often used when talking about philosophers in the early modern historical period. When we're talking about John Locke, for example, when we're talking about Bishop Berkeley, we often use this distinction to be able to compare those thinkers with, for example, Descartes. So you can see where I got this from. I took this from from Lawrence Nolan's introduction to an edited volume titled Primary and Secondary Qualities, the Historical Ongoing Debates. And so I thought I would just quickly read this to you, and you have this here to see, and you'll immediately recognize how this relates to Descartes' wax example. The objects that we experience with our senses appear to have various properties, including extension or spatial dimension, size, shape, motion, and position on the one hand, as well as color, sound, taste, odor, heat, cold, etc. on the other hand. However, the 17th century revolution in science ushered in a radically new conception of the nature of physical objects that sought to revise this common sense picture known as mechanism. So often Descartes' physics is referred to as mechanical or mechanistic. The new science conceived the universe on the model of a machine and tried to explain all physical phenomena in terms of the mechanical properties of the insensible small parts of matter. If the universe is like a machine, then the only salient properties for the purpose of scientific explanation are those that enable one object to causally affect another through direct contact. Just as one explains the operation of a clock by appealing exclusively to the size, shape, and motion of its gears, the color of the clock or the sound it makes when it chimes on the hour are irrelevant to understanding how it keeps time, and thus do not figure in such explanations. As a consequence, the new science restricted the real qualities of bodies to those that can be understood in mechanical or geometric terms, and treated qualities such as sensuous red as mere appearances. Another way of expressing these points is to say that the mechanical philosophers drew a distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and that this distinction was at the heart of a new science. The primary qualities were so called because of their privileged role in scientific explanation, in contrast to the secondary qualities. All right. Thank you, Dr. Nolan. Now we're going to look at the history of the wax example. And of course, in a sense, Descartes is a kind of footnote to Plato. And I was surprised to see that at least the YouTube videos that I looked at regarding Descartes' wax example did not discuss the history of Descartes' wax example. So I thought that it would be helpful for us to look at the history of the wax example. So Plato uses wax as a metaphor in the Timaeus. However, his most famous use of the wax as a metaphor comes from the Theaetetus. Now, the central question of the Theaetetus is, what is knowledge? And Plato famously offers 3 analogies toward an answer to that question. These 3 analogies in the Theaetetus are the wax example, the aviary example, and the midwife example. So what's important to notice here is that Plato rejects the wax example, and he moves on to, he has Socrates in discussion with Theaetetus. He has Socrates move beyond the wax example to the aviary example, beyond the aviary example to the midwife example. And so on the one hand, we can ask the question, why does Plato reject the wax example? I initially thought that it would be helpful to go through and explain each of these examples, but this presentation is becoming so long already that I decided that I would leave those discussions until we actually talk about Plato. But we should ask the question, why does Plato reject the wax example as an answer, to the question, what is knowledge? So here, if we're looking at the dialogue, we can see that Theaetetus is speaking with Socrates, and Socrates says, I am going to maintain that we were wrong to agree that it is impossible for a man to be in error through judging that things he knows are things he doesn't know. In a way, it is possible. I thought it was fun and interesting to start with this because so many people believe this false claim that Socrates somewhere said that the only thing he knows is that he knows nothing. I just find that hard to believe. So Socrates then says, but didn't we recoil from this suggestion because it made us not know when we do know things which we know? So here's Socrates saying that there are things that he knows, and he knows that he knows them. Theaetetus, yes, we certainly did. Socrates says, then don't let us put the case in that way. Let's try another way. It may prove amenable, or it may be obstinate. But the fact is, we are in an extremity that we need to turn every argument over and over and test it from all sides. Now, see if there is anything in this. Is it possible to learn something you didn't know before? Surely it is, says Theaetetus. Socrates, and again, another and yet another thing? Theaetetus, well, why not? Socrates, now I want you to suppose, for the sake of argument, that we have in our souls a block of wax, larger in one person, smaller in another, and of purer wax in one case, dirtier in another, in some men rather hard, in others rather soft, while in some it is of the proper consistency. All right, Theaetetus says, I'm supposing that. So then Socrates says, we may look upon it then as a gift of memory, the mother of the muses. We make impressions upon this of everything we wish to remember among the things we have seen or heard or thought of ourselves. We hold the wax under our perceptions and thoughts and take a stamp from them in the way in which we take the imprints of signet rings. Whatever is impressed upon the wax we remember and know as long as the image remains in the wax. Whatever is obliterated or cannot be impressed, we forget and do not know. All right, Socrates, in discussing this then, he says, thirdly, supposing I am not acquainted with either of you, Theaetetus and Theodorus, and am not perceiving either of you, I could not possibly think that one of you, whom I don't know, is another of you whom I don't know. So this is an interesting point that Socrates is initiating here. This idea that if I don't know someone, then I can't mistake you for being that person that I don't know, because I don't know them. So Socrates here, now will you please take it that you have heard all over again in succession the other cases described before, the cases in which I shall never judge falsely about you and Theodorus, either when I am familiar or when I am unfamiliar with both of you, or when I know one and not the other, and similarly with perceptions. You follow me? Theaetetus, I follow. Socrates, so there remains the possibility of false judgment in this case. I know both you and Theodorus. I have your signs upon that block of wax, like the imprints of rings. Then I see you both in the distance, but cannot see you well enough. But I am in a hurry to refer the proper sign to the proper visual perception, and so get this fitted into the trace of itself, that recognition may take place. This I fail to do. I get them out of line, applying the visual perception of the one to the sign of the other. It is like people putting their shoes on the wrong feet, or like what happens when we look at things in mirrors, when left and right change places. It is then that heterodoxy or false judgment arises. Theaetetus. Yes, that seems very likely, Socrates. It is an awfully good description of what happens to the judgment. All right, so notice that the wax example imagines a wax tablet in the soul into which impressions are made. And what Socrates is discussing in this passage from the Theaetetus is this idea that false judgment is possible. And so he's asking the question, how is false judgment possible? And I'm going to move to the next slide here so we can see a little bit of a discussion of this. Notice that why does Plato reject the wax example as an answer for the question, what is knowledge? The wax example in Plato's Theaetetus was put forth as a possible way to account for knowledge. However, since the wax example cannot account for false judgments, Plato moves on to consider the aviary example. This is directly relevant for Descartes' Meditations because Descartes can be read as attempting to handle the false judgment feature by way of a hyperbolic doubt, or the method of hyperbolic doubt, and God, before re-invoking the wax example. So I really think that this is relevant and interesting to this, an interesting connection to make. So let me just say it one more time, perhaps in a little bit simpler language. So it is possible to say something like Descartes is taking the wax example from the Theaetetus and saying something like, well, I think the wax example is right. I think that the wax example gives a better account of knowledge than the other accounts offered in the Theaetetus. And then he says, well, why is it that Plato rejected the wax example? Well, Plato rejected the wax example according to the Theaetetus, because it can't account for the fact that there are false judgments. So Descartes says, well, we can stick to the wax example and account for false judgments by just reformulating our approach to accounting for knowledge. And this is, in a sense, this idea that we must have the right method. And so therefore, it's not sufficient just to seek out criteria. We must also recognize that there are criteria that are governing our seeking out criteria. And so therefore, we could say something like, so Descartes can be seen here as saying something like, well, if we use this method of doubt, of hyperbolic doubt, and then we bring God in later, it becomes possible to use the method of hyperbolic doubt and God to account for false judgments. And then by being able to account for false judgments, then perhaps the wax example is sufficient for accounting for knowledge, to give an account of knowledge. So I just think that it's worth knowing this relationship here between Plato and Descartes. All right, so, but of course, Aristotle also has a wax example, and Aristotle's wax example is probably more famous than Plato's wax example. I find this, I put together a talk on the four causes, and when you hear the four causes, you immediately think Aristotle, but actually they were in Plato before Aristotle. So it's always fascinating to see that, because I feel like many instructors at universities just don't explain that. Okay, so here we go in Aristotle. Of course, the wax example comes from Aristotle's On the Soul, or the De Anima, and you can see it at the bottom of the slide. So the wax example as accounting for perception, characterized in terms of the four causes. So really what we see here is this, adding the discussion of the four causes to the wax example. The material cause, the formal cause, and the efficient cause. And we can talk about these later on, but especially here, we're not focusing on the final cause. We're focusing on material, formal, and efficient causes. And again, we'll talk about the four causes in an episode of its own. So not just emphasizing sensation as passive. So Aristotle's wax example is not just emphasizing sensation as passive. And in a criteriological statement that, in my opinion, anticipates Kant's Copernican revolution, Aristotle discusses conditions for the possibility of perception as being species specific. So if you take all of this into account here, you'll see that the section 12, he says, generally about all perception, we can say that a sense is what has the power of receiving into itself the sensible forms of things without the matter, in the way in which a piece of wax takes on the impress of a signet ring without the iron or gold. So notice here, this is exactly what Descartes' talking about. Notice that it also is an exact echo or repetition in Aristotle from Plato. What produces the impression is a signet of bronze or gold, but not qua, or not as bronze or gold. In a similar way, the sense is affected by what is colored or flavored or sounding, not insofar as each is what it is, but insofar as it is of such and such a sort and according to its form. So if anybody ever tells you, hey, it is what it is, you can say, well, Aristotle says, not so much. A primary sense organ is that in which such a power is seated. So the sense and its organ are the same in fact, but their essence is not the same. I don't think that I'm going to read all of this to you, but you can read it if you'd like. This is Aristotle's description of sensation and how it occurs. The important piece here is that we get this combination of, as we just saw on the previous slide, the important piece is that we get this combination of the four causes with the wax example. And you can also see that the wax example is being used here to account for sensation. Okay, here is Avicenna's wax example. So in regard to perception as an efficient cause, so perception as an efficient cause. So you could say that I have an object of experience, or there's an object in my mind, and perception, my perception of things external to the mind, functions as an efficient cause. So if you think about the four causes in relation to the statue of the thinker, right? Rodin is the efficient cause. The sculptor is the efficient cause of the sculpture. So therefore, we could say something like the perception is sculpting our object of experience. The perception is functioning as the sculptor of this object in our mind that refers to something that is mind external. Okay, so Avicenna emphasizes Aristotle's discussion of the wax taking on the form and not the matter. Avicenna makes a distinction between the natural body and the mathematical or numerical body. So this is just brilliant work on Avicenna's part. But Descartes then, as we mentioned earlier, Descartes emphasized this distinction by way of his wax example in his letter from 1645. And this is the idea, again, that numerical identity does not depend on the identity of the bodies counted. Okay. All right, so as we're finishing up here. So substance and mode is one way to characterize. I feel as though this, of course, deserves its own episode at least, but I wanted to mention it so that you would at least see the big picture. It gestures toward the big picture that Descartes' involved in. So substance and mode, you can use that to refer to Descartes' ontology, and this is as opposed to Aristotle's substance and accident ontology. So we can see it like this. Instead of a plurality of substantial forms, so for Aristotle, when you could say a matter form composite constitutes a substantial form, unless you're just using the terms matter and form epistemologically, or there is a plurality of substantial forms in Aristotle's ontology, that each substance has its accidents. We want to understand every substantial form as having its accidents. In a sense, this is kind of a hangover from Plato and Plato's forms, it's a kind of empirical reading of Platonic forms. So then this is referred to as hylomorphism, of course. And so hyrle being the matter and morphe being the form. Hylomorphism referring to substantial forms. So Aristotle's hylomorphism and the metaphysics of substance and accident. Whether or not Socrates has long hair or short hair, whether he has a short beard or a long beard, whether he's wearing a toga or whether he's naked, that is accidental to Socrates' being, right? If Socrates eats a sandwich and gains 3 pounds, he doesn't stop being Socrates, right? So Socrates' weight can be understood as a kind of accidental property in relation to the substantial form that is Socrates. Okay, so now Descartes proposes 2 substances, mental and material, and modes of these substances instead of accidents. So you could say this idea that instead of having a plurality of substantial forms, now there are really just 2 substances according to Descartes. There's material substance, and its essence is extension, and its modes constitute mechanics, right? The new mechanical science. And then the modes exist as a result of the ordering of the parts constituting a thing. So I think that that's important to understand in regard to the modes of the material substance. And then in this 1645 letter, again, notice how Descartes uses the wax example. It will help make sense of this substance mode distinction that he is using against Aristotle. So in discussing, I'm just going to read you Descartes' letter, right? So in discussing the Blessed Sacrament, I speak of the surface which is intermediate between 2 bodies. That is to say, between the bread or the body of Christ after the consecration and the air surrounding it. By surface, I do not mean any substance or real nature which could be destroyed by the omnipotence of God, but only a mode or manner of being which cannot be changed without a change in that in which or through which it exists. Just as it involves a contradiction for the square shape of a piece of wax to be taken away from it without any of the parts of the wax changing their place. This surface intermediate between the air and the bread does not differ in reality from the surface of the bread or from the surface of the air touching the bread. These 3 surfaces are in fact a single thing and differ only in relation to our thought. So, in other words, notice this analogy here. So shape is to body as mode is to substance. So just as the shape that the wax changes into does not change the wax substantially, in the same way we can say that there are different modes of substances, and that this is again in opposition to this idea of Aristotle's substance accident ontology. So what we just want to say quickly here is that this idea of the natural body as the substance versus the numerical body, and this numerical body as referring to a mode of the substance. All right, so we've looked at all of the wax examples in Descartes. I think that this takes us beyond what you can find on the internet presently, and I think that if you are able to follow what's talked about here, I think it's pretty straightforward. If you're able to follow what's talked about here, not only will you understand the wax example and thereby be able to help gain great insight into Descartes' meditations, but I also think that you'll have a more profound grasp on the material than the majority of the people in the room that you may be discussing it with. So feel free to bring this into your classrooms and to enlighten some of your instructors. Thank you so much. Please do like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next seminar. Thanks for being here.